Είναι ιδιαίτερη χαρά για μένα να παρουσιάσω εδώ σήμερα την φίλη μου, Joanna Bourke. Η Joanna είναι καθηγήτρια ιστορίας στο Birkbeck College του Λονδίνου. Είναι πολυγραφότατη, είναι πολύ μεταφρασμένη, πολύ βραβευμένη. Δυστυχώς στην Ελλάδα μόνο ένα βιβλίο της έχει μεταφραστεί, το βιβλίο για το φόβο και την ιστορία του. Ο τίτλος ακριβώς είναι «Φόβος, στιγμιότυπα από τον πολιτισμό του 19ου και του 20ου αιώνα» και έχει μεταφραστεί σε εκδόσεις Αβάλα το 2011. Η Joanna ασχολείται συστηματικά στο έργο της, επιχειρώντας να ιστορικοποιήσει το ανθρώπινο σώμα και το ανθρώπινο πνεύμα, καθώς και τις διάφορες αλήθειες που έχουν σχηματιστεί γι' αυτό, τις διάφορες ειδικότητες, τους διάφορους εμπειρογνώμονες που έχουν ασχοληθεί με το ανθρώπινο σώμα και το ανθρώπινο πνεύμα μέσα στο χρόνο. Από αυτή την άποψη η σεξουαλικότητα συνιστά θεματική που διατρέχει ένα μεγάλο μέρος του έργου της. Έχει όμως συστηματικά επεξεργαστεί τις πιο σκοτεινές πλευρές της σεξουαλικότητας. Έχει ένα βιβλίο του 2007 που ο τίτλος του είναι «Βιασμός, μια ιστορία από το 1800 μέχρι σήμερα», στο οποίο δεν κάνει την ιστορία του βιασμού από τη σκοπιά που την ακούσαμε σήμερα, παραδείγματος χάρη, αλλά εστιάζει στους βιαστές και επεξεργάζεται το πλήθος των προτάσεων που έχουν διατυπωθεί για το ποια ποινή τους αρμόζει και ποια θεραπεία ενδεχομένως τους αρμόζει. Τελευταία έχει ένα μεγάλο ερευνητικό πρόγραμμα με θέμα τη σεξουαλική βία, το οποίο είναι σε εξέλιξη, ανάμεσα σε πολλά άλλα πράγματα που κάνει η Joanna, και από αυτό είναι η δουλειά που θα μας παρουσιάσει σήμερα. Το θέμα της ανακοίνωσής της είναι μελαγχολικές αφηγήσεις και το τραύμα του βιασμού, μια ιστορία της ψυχιατρικής και της σεξουαλικής βίας. Joanna, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Let me just say it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here today. My friend Effie introducing me, which is a great honor, but also there are people here in this room who are working on topics that I would like very much to hear more about. My Greek wasn't up to attending, unfortunately, but I hope that we get time afterwards to talk to you and come up and speak to me. What I want to talk about today, though, is a British and American history. I want to take you to Manchester. The date is October 1833. 17-year-old mill worker Mayor Anne Huey was gang raped. Now, the newspapers were really keen to note that she was, as they put it, delicately formed, and though not handsome, exhibits a simplicity of expression, by no means unprepossessing. The indisposition, these words you'll see as I give the paper are going to be important. The indisposition of the wretched victim meant that she was unable to attend court the first day. When she did appear, wine, salts, and other restoratives were constantly administered to her to keep her from sinking under the effort. The papers said that they would report the substance of her melancholy narrative, as far as we can reduce such truly disgusting particulars to a narratable form. They then, however, went on to describe these disgusting particulars, actually in great depth, and greater depth than we would ever read in newspapers today. They described how 5 young men raped Huey multiple times, calling her a bitch. One flogged her with his braces, then made water upon her. After the ordeal, Huey went home, but could not for shame tell her mother. She went to work the following day, but felt very ill. A blindness came over her, and she could not see her work. and pain eventually led her to report the attack to her married sister. Now I start with this melancholy narrative, as the papers called it time and again, in order to reflect on the historically malleable, the very changing ways that sexual violence was both experienced and interpreted. For Hui, as for nearly all violated women in the past, in the British and American context, sexual violence was a sexual act. It was vastly different. It was perceived as being vastly different from other forms of assault. The post-1970s feminist mantra that rape is about violence, not sex, would not be recognized by women like Hui, for whom rape was fundamentally an attack on their sexual honor, their reproductive capacities, and, of course, moral standing within their own communities. In whatever period we explore, rape is, of course, a form of social performance. It's highly ritualized. It varies between countries and, of course, across time. There is nothing universal about it. As in the account of Hui's rape, meaning has not been stripped bare from acts of brutality, but in fact has been rather generously bestowed. The important thing to note, I think, is that these frames of meaning have a history. And in my book, I published actually 10 years ago, I don't believe it, Effie, 10 years ago, called Rape, A History from the 1860s to the Present, I explore the changing meaning of sexual violence as understood from the standpoint of perpetrators. I asked, how has the figure of the rapist changed over time? Today, though, I'm going to do something very, very different. I want to turn to the victims of sexual assault, and in particular, the aftermath of rape for those victims. And yes, I am going to be using the term victim rather than survivor for at least two reasons. First reason is just to remind us, of course, that not all victims are, in fact, survivors. And second, because the victim term is the term used at the time. But we can talk about this more fully if you want later. But I want to start with this talk with what might seem as a digression, but bear with me because I hope to show you that it is not. First, I begin with some reflections on the way the histories of psychiatry have framed bad events. And I'm going to use that term advisedly, as I hope you'll see soon. How histories of psychiatry have framed bad events as trauma or traumatic events. Secondly, I'm going to then move back in time to Hui's rape, account of her rape, showing why the usual framing is in fact unhelpful if we are trying to understand Hui's experience of what was very much a bad event, as well as her society's theorizing of it. Here I argue that rather than a traumatic model being applied, there is a different frame of meaning, and that is an insensibility model. Third, I'm going to argue that both the insensibility and the traumatizing models played a surprisingly small part in medicine and psychiatry prior to the 1970s. And the fourth part is going to be saying why. I'm going to conclude by exploring the effects of these different frames of meaning for victims of sexual assault. But first, I'm actually going to start in the present. Historians of psychiatry have typically conceptualized bad events such as rape under the rubric of trauma or traumatic events. In what has come to be known as trauma studies, and actually I believe some people in this room work in that field, trauma studies, the social production of psychological symptoms, the disciplining of the disciplining power of psychiatry, and attacks on mind-body dichotomies have in fact become truisms in that whole field. At least since the 1990s, almost no one in the field questions the idea that the concept of trauma does a formidable amount of political and ideological work. A vast array of events and practices are subsumed under this trauma label, but there is no common understanding of either the ontology or the etiology of the concept, even in academic debates, analyses shift between mimetic and anti-mimetic theories of trauma, although the two models of trauma are in fact incompatible. I'm going to explain this just in a couple of minutes. The mimetic model, the mimetic theory, this theory is the more psychoanalytic theory of trauma. It presents the individual as traumatized by unconscious forces. Because trauma, according to this model, does not enter into any cognitive or perceptual framework, the traumatized person does not actually have access to it, direct access to it. She ends up, in other words, mirroring or imitating it. In the case of rape, this means such things as self-harm or the cycle of violence, victims ending up as perpetrators. In other words, mirroring it. In contrast, the anti-mimetic model posits trauma as a response to an external event, a bad event, that the traumatized person struggles to make sense of, to find meaning in. Such an approach encourages an analysis of the specificities of individual human experiences, including meticulous evaluations of variations according to gender, class, ethnicity, age, generations, sexuality, marital status, geographical location, ideological, political adherence, type of bad event, and so on and so on. Now, the mimetic model has been castigated by its opponents as either totally ahistorical or the opposite, overly narrowly historical, that is, late 19th century white male Viennese. The anti-mimetic model is accused by its opponents of assuming that a person experiences a bad event after which cognitive, affective, and motivational processes kick in, enabling the person to respond and interpret the event. In other words, these two models are entirely different ways of conceiving the role of individual agency in the world. Nevertheless, for historians, most historians, or many historians and social scientists, the anti-mimetic model has been the most productive. It enables us to fall back on our favorite methodological sleight of hand. That is, trauma is whatever people say is traumatic. In other words, for the purpose of historical research, so long as someone says they have been traumatized by a bad event, that claim is simply accepted. In practical terms, I think there are very many positives, there are very many advantages to such an approach. It, for example, avoids putting words into people's mouths. It neither pretends that the historian or social scientist can psychoanalyze dead people or those not present. It doesn't treat those others as, sort of people on our cultures. It's courteous to the ways people in the past have sought to make sense of their lives. It's respectfully neutral about which specific approach to trauma is being applied by people in the past, allowing for multitude, even conflicting characterizations. In other words, it means that we don't actually have to choose between mimetic and anti-mimetic approaches, but simply observe which approach historical actors within their specific contexts grasp when attempting to communicate meaning to others. And crucially, this approach allows us to explore how the label trauma changes over time. So the chief question, therefore, becomes, what does the content of any historically specific, geographically situated ontology tell us about the ways people in the past have understood bad events? By what, and this is the next question, is really important, and by what mechanisms do these understanding change? Now, this may seem like a major digression from the subject we're talking about today, but I think it's absolutely crucial if we are to attempt to understand the experience and framing of sexual violence in the past. In the context of today's theme, I'm now going to explore just one aspect of the anti-mimetic approach to bad events, as it emerges through the language of sexual violence. My fundamental point will be to show how responses, cognitive, bodily, emotional, to one particular bad event, sexual assault, was very different in the period prior to the 1860s, when the concept of trauma was first invented. So I don't have time to go into great detail today, but I'm willing to in discussion. But briefly, this notion of psychological trauma entered public discourse in relation to the British crisis of railway accidents. So the work of John Erik Erikson in the 1860s, 1866. In other words, trauma moved away from its original Greek meaning, bodily injury, where we get the English phrase trauma wards in hospitals, to what we mean today, that is, an inner emotional response to a bad external event. This happened as late for the first time in the 1860s, when, in fact, Freud, of course, was still a very young child. So, in fact, confusingly, the anti-mimetic precedes the mimetic. From this time onwards, 1860s onwards, the notion of trauma catapulted into mainstream understandings of the self and quickly became applied to every, or nearly every, bad event. My point is that prior to the 1860s, trauma was not the way people thought they responded to bad events. But another way, in this earlier period, it's wrong to speak about traumatic events, just bad events. Take, for example, to illustrate this, go back to Huey's rape in 1833, 30 years before the invention of trauma. The way her suffering is framed is, in fact, a classic description of the after effects of rape as understood in 19th century England and America. Okay. That's why I chose it. It's a beautiful, classic description of how rape was understood in this earlier period. How was her melancholic narrative told? Again, think back of those words that I started this talk with. Most importantly, Huey was said to be suffering from what was then called conversion hysteria. She became blind. In other words, she converted her wish not to see what was happening to her into a literal not able to see. But note another crucial word in the account of Huey's rape: insensibility, a term that is used, and this is no exaggeration, that is used in nearly all published accounts of rape in that period. Insensibility. And as I've argued elsewhere, I think it's impossible to exaggerate the extent to which victims of rape in the 19th century were said to have been rendered insensible. Now, that term, insensible, or insensibility, had a very different meaning in the 19th century to what it has today. I mean, today, when we say someone is sensible, we mean that they are intelligent. She's a sensible woman. But in the period we're talking about, it actually means the exact opposite. Sensible in the period in the 1830s meant a capacity for feeling the senses. Insensibility was therefore a lack of feeling. Not unconsciousness, people who are insensible walk around, not unconsciousness, but it is what, again, the word that Huey uses, but so many others do, it is a sinking into the self. This was understood at the time as an infliction of the physiological nervous system. Disorders such as melancholy were thought to be due to either a stoppage or an excess of nervous vibrations within the body that had a direct impact on mental symptoms, or what they used to call vapors within the body. The brutal physical attack, therefore, on Huey's body would inevitably affect her nerves, plunging her into melancholia. Strange perhaps to modern ears, rape victims like Hui claimed to be insensible in order to talk about their experiences. Unlike the modern notion of hysteria, particularly within the mimetic model, as involving a silencing or a muddling of the self, an inability to communicate some terrible harm, in this earlier period, hysteria is associated with speech, a truthful speech, a truthful rendering of suffering. Ironically, it was precisely the testimony of the insensible body that enabled women to speak about violation. It provided incontrovertible proof of their moral virtue. In other words, the sensible, meaning feeling, the sensible body was seductive and either invited abuse or would have been able to repulse any attack. The insensible rape victim testified to true violation. The emphasis on Hui's delicacy then was not only proof of her inability to fight off the rapist, although it is that as well, but also crucially of her moral virtue and simplicity, which is another word used in all these accounts. Only the nervous, insensible body could speak of sexual violation. Now, these responses to sexual assault are a world away, of course, from the trauma model that we are familiar with later of the century, where the wound is psychological rather than due to vapors and nerves. Indeed, when nerves are mentioned in the trauma, modern trauma model, they are in fact metaphorical entities. Hysteria is a distorting influence rather than an outpouring of authentic experience. In both the insensible and traumatizing models, however, medicine and psychiatry played a surprisingly small part prior to the 1970s. Very recent. Maybe not for some of you in this room, but for me, 1970s. Indeed, in contrast to legal and newspaper texts, such as the one reporting Hui's gang rape, and also, of course, in contrast to novels and other literary productions, medical and psychiatric texts were relatively silent about the after effects of rape until the 1970s. Prior to this period, prior to the 1970s, when psychiatric texts did deal with sexual assault, they either focused on victims as liars or as people who precipitated the attack by their unwise actions. From the first decade of the 19th century, when texts in medical jurisprudence started being published in large numbers, it was standard to warn police surgeons about the propensity of women to lie about rape. This persisted well up until late 20th century and indeed 21st century. For instance, just to give a couple of examples, 1969, the Association of Police Surgeons of Great Britain published an instruction manual entitled The Practical Police Surgeon, which emphasized that complaints of rape were often unjustly made or made for the purpose of blackmail. In the 1978 edition, Stanley Herbert Burgess, president of the association, explained that many allegations of sexual assault are based upon the perjured evidence of an amoral accuser who sought to establish an alibi to appease parents, husband or lover. Revenge and fear of pregnancy or venereal disease were also said to drive women to lie. Similarly, 1975, editor of the British Medical Journal informed doctors that there was no clear borderline between seduction and rape. Indeed, he continued, there were also some women who seemed to have invited their adventure, and when it is over, they somehow feel cheated and claimed to have been raped. 9 years later, 1984, Inspector Sandra Hood. Now, Sandra Hood was responsible for training police doctors about how to deal with rape victims. But in fact, what she was doing was she calmly informed police doctors that the female of the species is a devious creature. Within psychiatry, sexual violence was also widely understood to be victim-precipitated. This was dominant. In fact, it's the dominant line within the mimetic theory that I mentioned. Again, some examples. 1940, psychoanalyst Hans von Hichtig believed that raped women were born victims, self-harming and self-destroying. An author in 1957 edition of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis even claimed that rape victims were on the side of the rapist. A woman might unconsciously tempt the offender into carrying out the attack precisely in order to rid herself of the fear of rape, observed the author of Sexual Behavior in the Law. He added that a woman might allow herself to be raped in actuality in order to deal with it in fantasy. Or, as very eminent forensic psychiatrist Seymour Halleck put it in 1972, the rape victim frequently played as large a role in precipitating the offense as the offender. Many rapes might never have taken place had the victim, in inverted commas, not been both flirtatious and ambivalent as to her desire for a sexual experience. Of course, by placing the word victim there in inverted commas, Halleck is implicitly questioning her accusation of assault. Now, if psychiatric texts have generally ignored women's experience of rape, except by labeling them either liars or claiming they encouraged it, the same is not the case, interestingly, if we look at how they dealt with perpetrators of sexual violence. In other words, perpetrators of rape, they were quite happy to and quite easy to medicalize in psychiatric texts as men who were suffering from an affliction against which they struggled in vain. Again, this is a complex phenomenon, but broadly speaking, we can talk about this later if you like. Broadly speaking, we can trace a shift, a change in psychiatric texts from the perpetrator being conceived of as a degenerate, Lombroso, suffering from, this is broadly chronological, suffering from moral insanity, the likes of Pritchard, being seen as perverts, late 19th century, people like Krafft-Ebing, and finally, attention being paid to personality from the 1970s onwards. In broad terms, these shifts represent a move from insanity and degeneration towards questions of motivation, and indeed personality. In other words, the movement is towards the rapist as every man. In contrast, rape was not medicalized as a problem for victims until the 1970s, and it took this until the 1970s for the first, I'd be interested to know about in Greece, first in Britain and America, first substantial study of rape victims to be published. It will not surprise any of us here that the people to do this work, those responsible, were feminists. The nurse, Anne Burgess, and the sociologist, Lyndall Holmstrom. 1972, when their collaboration started, Holmstrom already had a long experience in the women's movement. She had extensive knowledge of medical sociology, having recently finished a project on two-career families. Burgess was a psychiatric nurse. She had not originally wanted to be a nurse, let alone a psychiatric nurse. Rather, she aspired to follow her jazz musician brother into a professional music career. She was an exceptionally talented pianist. Gender, however, dictated otherwise. Her mother wanted her to have steady work, such as that of a teacher or nurse, and she only chose nurse because it seemed second best to music. Her early experience, though, of hospital nursing was eye-opening. She wrote, "I saw that nurses were taught to give up their seats to doctors and to eat in separate dining rooms. There was a complete devaluation of nurses' work. Nurses were not even allowed to describe blood as blood. We had to call it red fluid. Doctors dominated the work setting. Nurses were seen as the handmaidens." 1972, when she was approached by Holmstrom to work on rape victims, Burgess immediately realized that her training in theoretical psychoanalysis was not going to be of any help. She also realized that this was an opportunity to make a difference to women's lives. Their first hurdle was to find victims to talk to. The courts stonewalled them. Criminologists were, oh, so very polite, but unhelpful. The police were totally impossible, not even returning their phone calls. Doctors were insulting. So in their despair, they turned to hospital nurses, Hospital of Boston College. Immediately, doors opened and widely. Nurses proved welcoming, freely sharing their experience in dealing with rape victims and warning them of the obstacles they were going to come across, such as the police are in a hurry and they're going to rush you. A protocol was worked out. 2 days later, their work began. In total, they talked to 146 rape victims, all of whom welcomed their help. Now, admittedly, their role was not always clear to staff or, indeed, patients. It wouldn't pass ethics today. Dubbed the rape ladies, they were mistaken for social workers, psychiatrists, shrinks, doctors, counselors, members of the hospital social services. One physician assumed that because they were from Boston College, they had to be nuns, until he noted that one of them was very, very seriously pregnant. It was, however, worthwhile because 1974, 2 years later, Holmstrom and Burgess published in the very, very prestigious American Journal of Psychiatry in what was to become one of the most influential articles, medical articles, in the history of sexual violence. Entitled Rape Trauma Syndrome, it was a detailed analysis of 92 rape victims admitted to the emergency ward. Burgess and Holmstrom effectively invented a new diagnosis called rape trauma syndrome. They defined this syndrome as an acute stress reaction to a life-threatening situation. Crucially, they regarded the vastly different ways in which women responded to rape as normal. That's so crucial. Why was it this invention of RTS so important? 3 reasons. First, as I've mentioned, until this time, the responses of adult women to rape were pathologized. The accusers were said to be liars, hysterics, nymphomaniacs. Medical personnel believed that if a woman became hysterical after an assault, this was, in fact, proof that the accusation was false. In contrast, Burgess and Holmstrom insisted that extreme emotional disturbance after sexual assault was normal. They observed that women responded to rape in a wide variety of ways, none of which should deny the reality of their experience. Burgess and Holmstrom even bravely insisted that laughing might even be an appropriate coping device for victims. Second, Burgess and Holmstrom insisted on the specific nature of a sexual assault, claiming it wasn't just another generic bad event, like a train accident or combat. They invented the diagnosis specifically for this kind of trauma. Victims would suffer from rape trauma syndrome. Third, this meant that there needed to be radically new ways of treating victims. Absolutely crucially, treatment didn't end when the woman left the emergency room. Nurses were essential. Forensic nursing shortly after was introduced as a professional specialism. In the late 1970s, the first sexual assault nurse examiners, SANEs, were introduced. Now, the speed with which attitudes and practices changed, I think, can be suggested or looked at, judged, by looking at the title of Burgess's and Holmstrom's landmark book. In its first edition, 1974, it was called Rape Victims of Crisis. 5 years later, it was republished as Rape, Crisis, and Recovery. In other words, in that 5 years representing the shift towards feminist empowerment. It was no coincidence that these shifts were driven by female nurses rather than male physicians. After all, although they are generally hidden in the historical record, over the centuries, nurses played crucial roles with respect to sexual violence. In the 19th century, for example, it was midwives and nurses who examined victims. It was midwives and nurses who gave evidence in court and comforted women in the aftermath of what were often unsympathetic and intimidating courtroom arguments. Midwives and nurses were regularly asked by victims and their families to help them deal with the aftermath of sexual assault. Of course, let's not be too starry-eyed about this change. Although feminists did drive these reforms, they were also extremely important economic rationales for the increased use of nurses in sexual assault cases. Even supporters of the increased role of nurses routinely based their arguments on the fact that female nurses were cheap. Nurses were also forced to take on this job because male physicians basically were refusing to do so. And here, I think we see really quite a remarkable or interesting tension. On the one hand, male physicians did not want to relinquish their role as the authoritative figures in all aspects related to the injured or the broken body. Nurses were expected to be handmaidens, as Burgess put it, in the whole process. But on the other hand, these same physicians, and sometimes in the same paragraph, did not want to have anything to do with rape victims. Aftercare was time-consuming. Appearing to give evidence in court could take days, months. Misogynist attitudes meant that many of them fundamentally distrusted their patients. Okay, finally, why should this history of the treatment of rape victims be of interest to theorists of sexuality and feminism? The invention of rape trauma syndrome came, I think, at an important juncture in the history of feminism and sexuality, and I mean this very briefly in three ways. First, this was a time when the feminist mantra, rape is about violence, not sex, was coming to the fore. The trauma model was completely compatible with this ideology. Trauma was conceived of as a response to any bad event, any form of assault or attack. Its emphasis was not on the sexual part of sexual violence, but on the violence part. But secondly, and in contradiction to this, it also came at a time when feminists in the West were criticizing the medicalization of sexuality, particularly that of the rapist, and the pathologization of women's engagement in a misogynist world. Feminist nurses and other people working with rape victims began complaining that the trauma model risked pathologizing women's emotional reactions, thus imposing a second injury or wound. Third, trauma was quickly recognized as to be a normative concept. It distinguished normal violence, a husband slapping a wife, from what was excessive and therefore traumatizing. Trauma usually required a sudden event, a violent fissure. The language of psychological trauma might not then be applied to many people for whom bad events were endemic and related to issues such as poverty, patriarchy, racial prejudice. It's no coincidence that the rape trauma model was invented in the context of white middle-class women. For example, the most influential feminist research was the result of interviews with white, university-educated, middle-class volunteers who had been sexually assaulted while working in, listen to this euphemism, low-income neighborhoods, meaning African-American, low-income neighborhoods. The suffering of these middle-class women allowed the psychological harm of sexual violation specifically to be recognized by psychiatrists for the first time. In contrast, for working-class black girls and women who lived in those areas, violence was natural for both victims and perpetrators. Under the trauma model, sexual violence was privatized, attention moved from the external wound to the internal one. The political was made personal. The trauma model also fed into increasing tensions between the rape crisis centers, run largely by volunteers with very strong feminist motivations, and the sexual assault centers. In the early days, the distinction between the two was unclear. Indeed, huge overlap of personnel. But as time went on, staff in the sexual assault centers were required by government, by funding, to professionalize and get qualifications if they were to receive centrally allocated funds. This created the need to distinguish themselves from the feminist rape crisis centers. The sexual assault centers therefore rapidly jettisoned rape trauma syndrome for the PTSD label, which had the advantage of being legitimized by the DSM-3, this psychiatric Bible, if you like, from 1980. PTSD effectively moved the diagnosis away from an event-specific occurrence, rape, to something that was linked to a great many traumatic events, most notably war. It was difficult to convince psychiatrists and physicians, judges and juries that a woman forced to have sex with her husband was suffering from PTSD to the same degree that a soldier who had seen his comrades dismembered was suffering from PTSD. By codifying pain, the languages of psychology and psychiatry were appropriated, and then minimized the voices of those people experiencing the pain. I don't mean, I'm concluding now, I don't mean to imply that women were necessarily worse off. After all, the emphasis placed on social scripts and performance were just as important in the earlier period. 17-year-old mill worker Mary Ann Huey was required to play the insensible script, and she did so perfectly by sinking under the weight of her melancholic narrative. Huey's simplicity of expression, her insensibility, her melancholic recitation gave her a voice that could be heard in the courtroom. The trauma script of mid and late modernity tipped power in favor of other people's testimony, specifically those of psychiatrists and other physicians. Both ways of speaking about and responding to sexual violence performed a vast amount of political, ideological, rhetorical, and most importantly, personal labor. Thank you.